Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. Life is full of finite games with winners and losers. But our next guest says there's a much bigger game to play. What is the infinite game? Niki Harre joins us. She is a professor of psychology and associate dean for sustainability at the University of Auckland. She's the author of Psychology for a Better World and The Infinite Game, How to Live Well Together. So welcome to the Scholar Circle. It's great to have you, Niki Harre.
Great to be here, Maria.
And congratulations on this book, The Infinite Game, How to Play Well Together.
Thank you.
Now, this came from your previous work, so I thought perhaps we should start with your previous book and your findings in that particular book, Psychology for a Better World. And you suggested that to truly make a better world, we had to change our approach a little bit. So what was that approach, and then how did that lead you into this?
Well, one thing I became really aware of is that in the environmental and social justice movements, it's super easy to talk about the bad news because that's the stuff that immediately comes to our attention. But if you actually look at human psychology, what we respond to in terms of getting us active out there and working in community settings is the good news. So a lot of the emphasis in Psychology for a Better World is how to do these things positively. And that's why the sort of key mantra is inspiring people to take part in sustainability actions rather than sort of coercing them or setting up environments which they'll respond to with the right behaviour and all those sorts of ideas. So I did that book and lots of people responded to it really warmly, which was lovely. But I also realised there was this missing element. And the missing element was a story, a narrative, a symbol, something that could unite people who are really trying to make a difference. Like, what underpinning all of these different issues and causes, what are we trying to work towards and work for, and how do we go about doing that? So that was, in a nutshell, is the history of the infinite game.
And the infinite game, actually, you found that concept, the idea of the infinite game versus the finite game, from a philosopher. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that philosopher and what it was that struck you about this?
Yeah, so I kind of was vaguely then moving through the world with this idea of we need a metaphor, we need a way of describing these things. And then I happened to be listening to a podcast on the Canadian broadcasting show Ideas, and it was an interview with the philosopher James Carse, and it was actually about another one of his books, The Religious Case Against Belief. But in it, he really briefly mentioned this concept of the infinite game. And as he described it there, the purpose of the infinite game was to keep the game in play, and the purpose of a finite game was to end the game by winning. So I thought, whoa, this is a really interesting idea. And I immediately read his book called Finite and Infinite Games, and then have spent the last 5 years just teasing that out, exploring it. And because I'm a psychologist, not a philosopher, I always want to sort of talk to real people and see, how they're engaging with it as well.
So the idea of the game itself is really a way of approaching life.
Yeah.
It's a way of viewing life as a series of games, not really a particular game. It's a way of approaching life. And so it's not truly infinite. It's just that we're keeping it going.
Yeah, I mean, the word infinite, I love the word infinite and have thought about it a lot because infinite as a concept is expanding in all directions. It's looking at the really small and seeing the possibility in that. It's the way in which there's multiple interpretations of everything. So the fact of time, the idea of it extending into the future, is just one of the dimensions of the infinite game. But absolutely, I'm talking here about the human game, and the human game in an absolute sense is very unlikely to go on forever. So the infinite aspect of it is more about keeping this going as if there's no end, acting in terms of the now being incredibly rich and full of possibility, and not doing things that will prevent the future being equally so.
That's quite beautiful, actually. So one way you described it was the infinite game is the mighty game, from which finite games arise and into which they eventually disappear. What do you mean by disappear?
So if we think of the infinite game as a kind of pool, if you like, an endlessly changing, infinitely rich sphere in which the things that help us thrive, both as individuals and as communities and as a planet as a whole, are all in play. Right? If that's the infinite game, then as human beings, what we need to do is structure societies through finite games in order to manifest these. So if we take something like school, the school curriculum, let's take that as an example. So what are we trying to do in schools? Well, at its best, what schools are trying to do is bring together young people, enrich them, socialise them, help them think about what matters, find themselves. These are all the beautiful ideas behind schooling. But to do that, we need to structure the school. You can't just throw them all together and say, go for it. Well, I don't think you can. And so we need curriculum. We need to say, what is it that we want the children to learn? We need timetables. We need teachers who are trained. So all of those in a sense of finite games in which there are criteria. If you meet the criteria, you, in a sense, win the game. We can talk more about what winning means a bit later, if that would be useful. And if you don't meet the criteria, you haven't won the game. You might play again, you might find a different game or whatever. So games arise from this because we structure society to try and keep these infinite values or ideas or possibilities in play. When they are working well, they're doing that. So we feel we're in community, we're expressing ourselves, we're protecting the natural environment, all those kinds of things. When they're not working so well, we're in competition with each other, we're damaging the natural environment, we're not expressing ourselves. Sometimes even those games that are damaging can just keep going by their sheer momentum. I mean, too big to fail is a classic example of that. What does that mean? Like, we've created this huge structure that we know is doing damage, but it is such an pivotal part of social life. It's too big to fail. That to me is super scary, because what we should be doing, the kind of society I'd like to live in, is these structures come up, they help us live, and then when we can see the damage that we're doing, because we're always going to be doing damage, it's a constant adjustment, we think, how do we change this game? And then we bring it back to those things that we really care about.
So, and that's what you meant by, in the infinite game, all the finite games are on probation.
Absolutely. Yeah. The school curriculum's on probation. Is it doing what it needs? If not, let's revise it.
Yeah. The political system's on probation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it doing what it needs? If not, let's find another game.
Exactly.
You know, it's interesting, too, because the way you describe many of the aspects of what you call the finite game, you know, that competition, this sort of damaging, that there's something going on here that's not really making a good society. It sounds like you're putting most of the finite games, most of the systems in society on trial.
Yeah, I mean, it's this good-bad thing is really interesting. I would agree with you on putting them on trial. I guess I'm not saying that my verdict is guilty every time. And usually it's often just really slight tweaking to things. For example, I work a lot in sustainability circles, and when I was working on a big sustainable school project and we were trying to inspire interest, one of the first things everybody thought of is, let's have a competition. And I thought of it too, you know, let's have a competition. What that does is that energises people and it gets them participating. And then you realise our competition in that particular instance was around painting murals for the sides of new waste stations. It got people energised, got them participating. But then we realised someone has to win. And what's more, lots of people have to lose. And so what's that going to be doing for inspiring people to take part in sustainability if we say, great job, but this one's better? That's, you know, the message in that is really problematic. So but you don't actually have to throw away the whole idea. You can instead have a workshop where you do exactly the same thing, and you can inspire participation by giving people food, by being incredibly nice to people, by being welcoming, beautiful environments, all of those kinds of things. And then people come in, they do what they're going to do. You get these products, you get this engagement, and you haven't divided people by competition. So often it's not a kind of radical move that chucks out the whole institution. It's just really rethinking what messages we're leaving people with.
It sort of correlates with, even though you said not radical, you do have a chapter called Radical Cooperation.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like what you're looking to is this idea of cooperation more than competition. You used a lot of examples in the book from biological organisms about how really we are, as living things, more cooperative than competitive. Can you give us some more examples of that and how that sort of butts up against the kind of social system that we're, socialized into?
Yeah. Well, so one of the sort of prevalent underpinning stories, if you like, of Western civilization is the theory of evolution as it's taught. So I'm not trying to say there's only one version of the theory of evolution, or if you talk to an evolutionary scientist, they'd give you the pitch I'm about to give you now. But the core simplified pitch that tends to be sort of taken up is that life moves through competition and the fittest survive. So it's a survival of the fittest narrative. Those who are cleverer, those who are stronger, those who are better in whatever regard, rise to the top naturally through this process, and that is a good thing. So if in our societies we have competitive businesses, for example, what will happen naturally through this process is the most efficient, the most useful, even the most environmentally friendly will naturally rise to the surface and all will be good. So this is the model that competition in this kind of way provides a sort of engine room of society. But actually, when you to take humans first, and we'll go back to other sort of biological systems. If you actually look at, if you spend a little bit of time looking at how human beings operate, what people do really naturally and really easily is share. If you've got an idea, the first thing you want to do is tell somebody. And trying to keep that idea for yourself and work in your lab on getting this to the perfect point, or the market, getting the product so it's market ready. It's actually a really unnatural kind of behaviour, because what we're prone to do is share this and then get a response to it and then elaborate the idea naturally, if you like, with other people. So this competitive model, in my view, actually doesn't reflect our nature, and certainly not our best nature, certainly not our productive nature. If we think about other biological organisms, even our body, for example, is made up of different kinds of cells. So, we've got heart cells, liver cells, all of these different cells. And there's a sense in which you can think of all those as individual things trying their best just to survive if you're using a survival of the fittest model. But we know the body has to work as a whole. So somehow the liver and the heart and all of those different bits have learnt to cooperate and are feeding into each other. So it's quite easy to think of our bodies as cooperative beings in which the ability to contribute to the whole, so the ability of the heart to give something to the body that is essential, is why the heart's there. The heart couldn't be there if it was just some great, wonderful, I've won the competition organ. It doesn't make any sense. So I find it fascinating, the idea that we could expand that out. So why are you and I here? Because we're sort of wonderful people that have won? No, because we're here to the extent that we're giving and interfacing with the rest of life and being part of a community. And I think it's fascinating that when you look at any natural environment, you can say something that's doing really well is the best competitor, or you can say it's the most generous cooperator. You can almost always look at it from both those angles. So if we think of trees in a forest, what are trees doing? On one level, they seem like the lions, the ones that are at the top, but they're providing so much for all of these other life forms within the forest, for smaller trees, for insects, for plants, for fungi, the whole thing. Their roots, we know a lot about the way in which tree roots are moving through the soil and the fungal networks that support those and so on. When a tree dies, of course, its body goes back into the soil and many organisms feast on it. So I think we've told the story from one point of view in which it can be completely turned around into a cooperative metaphor that, to me, actually fits the picture better and is just so much more inspiring and engaging, and so much more the world that I think our hearts are striving for, to use another metaphor.
Yeah, so it really is fitting in with what people in the natural sciences would call systems theory.
It is. I mean, that would absolutely, it is. It's complex systems, it's systems theory.
And that they all interact and they're all interconnected, and the effects of one influence the others.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to say there isn't an element of striving, of individual striving, of that little tree trying to get the sunlight, of little human beings sort of wanting to be able to do that gymnastic thing, to do that handstand, to do the writing.
But even that's a cooperative endeavor in many ways. There is an individual in the limelight, but there are all of the people engaged in that up until that limelight, as well as the audience and the judges and the society that created it, and et cetera.
Exactly, and and also when we're striving to be our best selves, So I'm striving to write my best book. You're striving to do your best interview. All of those kinds of things. That's a gift. That's a gift, because people doing their very best, they're beautiful to watch or listen to. So it's not that detracts. That actually
positively enhances.
Thank you. Yes.
So there was another section that this links into in your book, The Infinite Game, which was about how society, I mean, you called it magic tricks. And I could get where you were coming from on this, in that we are sometimes unaware of how we get linked into these things. But how would you describe these, what you called magic tricks?
So it goes back to this idea of having a narrative or a symbol or a metaphor, like survival of the fittest. And what happens essentially is we need to for things to make sense as human beings. We always have a way of saying, this is why we're going to war. This is why we're recycling our plastics. This is why our children are going to school. We've got something behind that, which when we're asked, we can respond in a way that kind of all adds up. So the magic tricks I'm talking about are the ways in which society as a whole, and I definitely don't want to blame it on particular players. I don't want to say it's, the six richest families or it's neoliberalism or whatever it is in particular. Society as a whole sort of co-constructs this idea about what is going on. And that's always a trick. And why I'm calling it a trick is because the people that are most active in constructing it and the people that sort of pump the lifeblood through it know that it's a trick. So to give you an example, if we think about modern medicine, doctors know that it's a very partial science, that there's a lot of artistry in it. Doctors know that you need to sit down with a patient, you give them a pill, you need to imply the pill will work in order for it to be fully effective. There's a huge placebo effect. And so in that sense, it's a kind of trickery. It's not a malicious trickery, and I don't mean that, but the doctor knows they're pulling a bit of a magic trick. And the doctor also knows that the more successfully they pull off that trick, the more I give you your antibiotics and you think, wow, my ear infection will be gone in a day, the more likely it is your ear infection will be gone.
So it's part of the design to use the tricks.
It's part of the design to use the trick, and it's part of this sort of mind-body connection that's so important to human beings to buy into those. There's an author, Johan Huizinga, that's written a book about the way in which many institutions come about through, he calls it games, or play, but you could call it a kind of trickery, in which one example he uses, if you think about rain dances, people living in tribal societies wanting the rain to come, so they do the rain dances and the rains come. And the people at the very centre of that dance, as those dances were constructed, they knew that it wasn't really going to work in some sense, but they kept up the ritual and the links appeared to be there, and everybody became invested in this as a way to structure themselves in society and make sense of it. So Western society is full of those kinds of things, of these sort of ways in which we know that we're playing, but we still have to keep that. It's a bit like when you put a Band-Aid on a little child's knee and say, they're all better now. The child thinks it is. You know that was a trick, but a useful trick. So again, it's separating out what are the useful good faith tricks from what are the ones that are problematic. Because there's no area in which you can stop playing completely, if you like.
So let's turn to some of the kind of darker realities.
Yeah.
Now, I know you work in sustainability, you work in social justice. I work on issues related to war and peace and genocide. There's some pretty dark realities out there. And one of the things that you point out in this book is that, yes, there are these dark realities, but we really, as a humanity, also have this life-giving, affirming, compassionate approach at times, which is part of perhaps the infinite game. You seem to want to choose to focus on that rather than on the dark stuff, the heavily win-lose, competitive, and losing in some of these games means mass death. Do you need to account for both? And if so, how?
That is a very good question. And I think how I would account for both is absolutely in part of the struggle to live life is to figure out how to yourself survive and grow, how to nurture those in your immediate social circle, and how to be part of the cooperative. It's not easy to get the balance right. And if you look at these, like you say, the dark side, very often how those situations have come about is through a sort of complex, they've always come about through a complex series of steps in which multiple small errors have been made. People who have less of a feel for the cooperative spirit, because I think there are definitely individual differences in this. The notion of some people being socio or psychopaths even might be a useful way of thinking about this. Letting those people get too much control in a society. The capacity we have in ourselves to enjoy competing and winning, again, gets a grip, and we're reinforced for that. Allowing often gender imbalance to come in so that we have groups of men deciding these things without what is often the softening or the effect of women who are in most societies more engaged with the really intimate process of being with children and rearing life and carry a different view potentially in these large environments. So to me, it's all these sort of slight, like you say, negative tendencies or the desire to just do really well and to be seen for your efforts and to show that you're powerful, all of those kinds of things, getting out of control. And sometimes people talk about evil flourishes when the good people don't speak up, a concept like that. And it's a little bit like that. Why do we allow people that we know or that we see are talking in a harmful way, that don't appear to have compassion? Why have we created political systems that allow those people to take leadership? That continues to puzzle me.
And so in those situations, when you have that, is there an approach in the infinite game that you think would be most fitting? Say, a war zone. Say, mass starvation. And in those situations, how do you see this interplay between the infinite and the finite game?
I mean, one of the things that I am careful to always say and do, and I'm not trying to just wheedle out of this difficult question, is that the people that know the context have to be the ones that respond to that context. So you take the principles. Okay, here's the principles. Inclusion. Have all the people that are part of this game, that are affected by this game, got voice? So in any situation which involves war, the answer is pretty much always no. So how do we bring those voices in? That's number one. And how do they do it in a way that is safe? Is this situation protecting the environment, the beauty of nature around us? And if it is not, if it is damaging that, how do we change our processes to ensure that is
And
kept
certainly
safe?
War is the most damaging.
It is the most damaging.
Yep.
So In terms of the intricacies of the actual situations, I can't comment on the specifics of each, but I do think that if you took people through an infinite game workshop and they were prepared to take that seriously, in which they thought about what they most deeply value, looked at the things that they're doing and tried to bring those values back in and make those adjustments, that would be a way in which you could resolve war.
Unless, of course, you're dealing with people, as you described earlier, who are more committed to the competitive game and more committed to winning over and above.
That's right.
The cooperative, the radical cooperation.
Yeah.
And this is something else that you mentioned in the book, which is perhaps to some degree, when possible, you steer clear of the people who are unconvincible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, the trouble becomes when you've let them get a lot of power, and when you're confused about how to get that power back. Often it takes some sort of revolution, coup, overthrow. Possibly, the democratic process allows, depending on the situation, a new political party to emerge that people vote for, and all of that kind of thing. So, I mean, I'm always saying, I said it in my Psychology for a Better World book too, don't work with the hardest people if you can avoid it, because in most of the things that we're talking about, you can actually get the people who are close on board and you can make a difference that way. But there's... I'm always suspicious of when people say that they've got no power. I working at a university, I see this sometimes where I read academic blogs about the nature of the neoliberal university, how we're under all this pressure to publish. All of this rhetoric that positions university academics as victims of a system they can't affect. Now, as a university academic, I know that I can resist many of those forces. I know there's multiple ways in which I can do things differently. Now, I'm not saying that what I do is necessarily noticed. I'm not saying it changes the system, but the victim discourse doesn't sit well with me as an academic, and it's really prevalent. So I'm reluctant to comment on situations that I know nothing about, but given my experience with situations I do know something about, I know the idea of being powerless can be a really tempting one. And I know that, and so I suspect, in most situations there are people there on the periphery. Okay, you've got your general or whoever it is that we might say is just almost completely corrupted at some kind of personal level. But there's almost always close people that could actually, stop saying yes, stop going along with that, and that carries a cost. And this is another important aspect of it. If you're in a system and you see the ways in which it isn't serving the infinite game, and you resist those or you speak up against those, you're not then necessarily going to win the brownie points that system has to offer. So that's where the sort of good people speaking out and resisting this comes in too. What game do you want to be playing? Is it most important to get ahead in your career, get in this person's good books, depending on the situation? Or is it most important to keep those deeper values in play?
Can you do both?
Yeah, the can you do both question is a really complex one. I'm not sure you can do both. I'm not sure you can simultaneously be playing both games. Having said that, if you are trying to keep things like inclusion, creativity, the protection of the natural world in play, because that fits with human thriving, because people want to thrive, very often that might lead to you winning the finite game or a finite game. If you're a teacher and you bring out the best in your students are also potentially going to do well in school exams. Not necessarily, but potentially. Certainly they're likely to go on to become thriving citizens. But I do think that if you deliberately try and win the finite game by its own rules, you're not playing the infinite game at that same time. I think we have to be careful about the idea that we can have our cake and eat it too. I think we have to be careful about that.
So let's turn to some of the more personal aspects of the infinite game. You talked about the difference in how we view our roles, for example, where the finite players might see people playing all these different roles, whether it's, I think pawn was one of them, or, I suppose you could see your allies or your detractors. How are these perspectives, this lens, how is it different for each?
Yeah, so to go through that list of ways in which you can play. So when you're playing the infinite game, essentially you're collaborators. So this is a good example. You and I are motivated here to have the best conversation we can have, and we're not trying. I mean, it would be bizarre to say that one of us is trying to win or something. That just doesn't make sense. So we're engaged in an infinite exchange in which we're motivated by almost like some third dimension, which is, the sake of this interview. When you're in finite games, very often people become objects of your play, not necessarily collaborators in that sense. So a pawn is an object of play. So if you start a war, for example, and you're a general, well, you need soldiers. And whether or not they want to play with you is not relevant because you need them. It's almost like, a chessboard. You need them for the objects of your play. So how do you mobilize them? Well, you might do so through stirring rhetoric, which you may or may not believe. You probably don't believe it fully. You do it through conscription. There's all sorts of ways. Again, if we stick with the war example, when you drop bombs on people in World War II, when Britain and her allies dropped bombs on German cities, they killed children. Those are pawns. Those are people that are affected by the game that do not want or weren't invited and not voluntary participants in this game. Finite games also require spectators. So one of the examples I give, again related to World War II, is that those of us who are now living many years after the war, are spectators of that war in the sense that we're told a story about what that war meant, and we're actually told a story of how we're meant to respond to that war as well, that it was a just war on the part of Britain and her allies, that there was great evil in terms of Hitler and the Jewish Holocaust and so on, and we're given a position that we're meant to take outside the game, but still sort of looking in on the game. And we're a very important part of the game because with many games, without spectators, the game couldn't exist. Most obvious example, sports game. What would it be to have the All Blacks, play international test rugby without all of us there, supporting them? So we're the key part of that game. You can also have allies in finite games in which you both know that you're not doing the kind of thing we are now, which is a very sort of open-ended process, but in which you've strategically aligned yourselves for the purpose, for some kind of purpose. And again, because finite games can be really useful, that can be really useful. You could have the 6 New Zealand universities get together and say, okay, we're allies here, and this idea of getting young people into universities because we have so much to offer. So let's do this, this, and this. And you may not even fully trust each other, but you set up rules that allow you to play together. So the roles of allies and spectators can be benign and helpful in games that are useful. Pawns, I think, are always problematic because they haven't chosen to play and because they're being manipulated for other people's
And you
ends.
mentioned in the book that a lot of the times we are pawns in somebody else's game. Somebody else has designed this game. We are just sort of forced into it and playing the role as a pawn. Yeah.
I mean, you think of many big companies and their marketing. I mean, it's blatant playing to people's deepest desires, knowing that actually the product doesn't really do what it claims to do. I mean, Coca-Cola is an example I use in the book. They play to happiness, community, friendship, being part of the group, things that we all need and crave. But of course, it's just an obvious trick that a bottle of fizzy, sugary water that creates untold single-use plastic bottles actually does that in some kind of way. So these marketing teams, again, they're blatant tricksters in the sense that they know full well that what they're doing is not actually, matching the deepest human needs, but they're keeping that going. And we, because You can drink a Coke sometimes and feel really cool, partly because they've told you you'll be cool if you drink it. We sort of buy into that. And of course, we don't necessarily have a choice in the sense that we're surrounded by all of these options. I often think it's amazing. Think about Aotearoa. Every piece of our country is owned by somebody. It might be the crown, the nation, but every centimetre of land is someone's, There's no free space in which you can move. So as people in society, what are you going to do? Send your children to school, they enter the school game. Go to university, you get a school game. House ownership game, the various jobs, the entertainment. It's all tied up by other people. So there's a sense in which we're always somewhat compromising. When you go buy clothes, you're always somewhat compromising. Rarely is the thing perfect in terms of all your criteria. So we have to make those compromises. And because we're used to doing that, sometimes it can be really difficult to tell which is the most suitable choice.
Yeah, so the last bit I wanted to get into really pertains to the personal experience. So we opened up this conversation, you talked a little bit about the present and the future, and approaching life with a little bit of both in mind, meaning being present in that sort of profound way, including with others, being present to others in a very profound way, in a very connected way, but doing these things in such a way that we're not compromising the future. So if you could talk a bit about this. It sounded almost like you were saying that the infinite game promotes a type of enlightenment, a sort of a Zen experience, or an experience that, parallels that. How does that all fit together?
Yeah, so the present and the future is a really interesting one, because as human beings we're living, well, at least in the present and the future, and very often in the past as well. So, our minds are carrying all these different spaces within them. And one thing that we very often do, because of our ability to think forward, is think to ourselves, I'll just do this for now. So we can think about that individually. Okay, I hate my job, but I've got a big mortgage. I'm just going to work long enough to pay off the mortgage, and then I'll be free to do what I really want. So we can imagine the steps that we need to go through to get to that point of freedom. If you think about a university academic, I'll just get tenure. I'll just get to senior lecturer. I'll just get to associate. Once I'm a professor, I'll stop playing this and I'll play the game I really want to play. So what I'm trying to talk about in the book is the idea that although some of that is necessary, very often we are telling ourselves about a life that will happen in the future when actually, life is happening right here and now. And this idea that we'll get to a place of safety and security where we can finally live our values is to me a really problematic illusion. As we know, again, through psychological research, people just tend to just sort of keep inching it forward to the next thing that they need to achieve. So part of it is that sort of Zen approach, if you like. What in your context right now is buzzing with life and the opportunity just to be and to nourish and to create, and can you live in that space as much as you can? At the same time, I don't want to throw the future out of the window. Part of that is my sustainability lens. When we think about environmental issues, we can be doing what right now for us at an individual level might feel nourishing. So travelling all over the world might feel like this, amazing form of self-expression. But actually, everybody travelling is really problematic in so many ways for the environment. So the key to me is finding a way to be in the present in which we still have a reasonable eye on both our personal future. Maybe you do need to pay off that mortgage and stay in that job right now. Maybe. I don't know. Again, it's up to every individual. So we need to keep the eye on the future, but we need to be in the present. And at the social level, at the broader level, I think it's hugely problematic to talk about the third world, the global south. We always find it strange talking about the global south when we're in New Zealand, but whatever is the term for countries that aren't fully invested and succeeding in corporate capitalism right now, the idea that those countries, China and India, but they need to develop. They need to use the coal in order to get to this point where they're rich enough, and once they're rich enough, then they'll be good to the environment, Or people in Bangladesh working on incredibly low wages, making our clothes. This is good for the economy of Bangladesh. And so it's okay that they're suffering now, because in the future, that will mean that the country is rich. I mean,
I don't know anybody who says those things.
That is said, though. Those things are said. I mean, I know, to actually say that and believe that.
And believe that is shocking.
It's shocking. It's shocking. But this rhetoric of hold on, your time will come, their time will come, is one of the things that holds back progress. And like you say, it's inhumane, it's shocking, and we shouldn't allow it. Yeah.
Well, let's just close with a few statements that were in the book. I'm going to read them off to you and have you just touch on each one of them and what they meant. So one of them you said is, good players play hard and act as if the game matters. And then you went on to talk about allowing the joys and sorrows to inform your decisions. What do you mean by all that?
Well, the act as if it matters is my way of taking that step back and acknowledging that I, like everyone else, if I take a position as a player, I'm not certain of anything except my own feelings and my own desire to play. So I don't want to make some sort of grand philosophical claim about the absolute truth. That's the sort of as if but part of it. And the joys and sorrows also comes back to my strong feeling that if we brought our emotions back into play, if we listened really carefully to what makes us happy and sad, that actually informs what's right and wrong. Because very often it's like, yeah, I know that you hate this or you hate that or you're struggling here, but keep at it because it's important, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes it might be, but you know what, if you sometimes listen to yourself and like, this career choice, this whatever it is, treating people in this way as I've been told to in my job, actually makes me feel somewhat ill. Listen to that. That feeling is important. And when things give you that, that incredible grounded happiness, that feeling that you are part of something, that you've got a euphoria that doesn't need to be guarded, listen to that, because you're in a space that is really important.
How about this one? There is no protection from connectedness.
Yeah. Well, the idea with and one of the things I find really tricky in our society is we're supposed to start saving for our old age when we leave school. So we are actually taught this concept that if you build around you enough of a castle, your investments, yourself, your career, all of those things, you will somehow be safe. But that is a complete illusion. There's no protection from the fact that you are always in a world interacting with other people that can change at any time. And instead of that having to be scary, oh my God, capitalism will collapse and my investments will go out the window. That, if we think about it from the other angle, is amazing, because whatever happens with these environmental disasters, should they happen, what I really hope is that we're able to approach them with a sort of loving connectedness between us. When I think about my children and the potential future of the planet, I just hope that they're surrounded by love and working together and getting on with it cooperatively. That's what I want for them. There's no protection, nor do we want it, from that interconnection.
And then finally, hypocrisy is fairly inevitable.
Yeah. Well, the thing about hypocrisy is that, when you say you think about slavery, the example of slavery in the civil rights movement in the US, you had to have people that owned slaves and said slavery was bad. Because if you really tease out the conditions of certain, rich white Americans at that time, to not own slaves would just be almost as impossible as not owning your car, or probably as impossible as not owning a car in Auckland or whatever. Very difficult, too big an ask. But you've still got to be able to say this is wrong, this is bad. You've still got to be able to fly and say, I don't think we should be flying so much. You've still got to be able to engage in social process, do social media and say, hey, people are on social media too much, because you've got to be able to work within the mechanisms of society, but take a position. At the same time, if you really believe that flying is not so good or whatever, you've got to try in your own life and be as good as you can. So it's like accepting hypocrisy, knowing you'll live in it, but trying as much as you can to limit that.
Well, Niki Harre, Professor of Psychology here at the University of Auckland. The new book is called The Infinite Game, How to Live Well Together. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was fabulous. Thanks, Maria.